Thanks for taking the time to talk about the very unusual circumstances facing all of the great powers in the Arctic at the present moment. And we have been thinking about and talking about and writing about together, Sasha, a number of the more salient issues involved in the Arctic great power competition. And I wonder if you could just set the stage for us a little bit. What does this Greenland episode tell us about great power competition in the Arctic in particular, but maybe more broadly to the extent that needs to be drawn in?
I think there are three layers to that. Overall, if we take a step back, Arctic role and prominence in all of the geopolitical discussions is increasing gradually and steadily. There is convergence of various factors, climate change, melting of the ice that makes some of the maritime routes or exploration of resources more commercially viable. We have an increasingly competitive nature of relationships between the great powers, including outright hostile, like between Russia and NATO. Well, not that much for now of Russia and the United States under Trump, but that was just very different with the US being the leader of the coalition to support Ukrainian war of self-defense against Russian invasion and helping Ukrainians to kill thousands of Russian soldiers on industrial scale in a broad daylight, something that the Russians know very well about, and something that is reminiscent of the kind of most dangerous pages of the Cold War, the proxy wars, War of the Korean Peninsula, to a lesser extent, Vietnam. And then obviously a very antagonistic, competitive relationship between China and the US, the two prime superpowers of the 21st century. Then the second element here is erosion of the Cold War arms control agreements. We are recording on the day when the START Treaty has expired. Trajectories of ballistic missiles that Russia aims at the United States and vice versa mostly go through the North Pole. So that's a very important part of the landscape. But also, we have a simultaneous erosion of governance mechanisms in the Arctic. There is Arctic Council to which Russia is a member, but de facto its membership is not formally cancelled, but frozen or put on ice. And the Arctic Council used to be NATO countries, Russia, plus neutral countries, Finland and Sweden. Now Finland and Sweden have joined NATO thanks to Russia's invasion. And that adds to the complexity of the Russian calculus. And as a result, Russia is increasingly reliant on its partnership with China to develop the Arctic, to make its commercial resources or maritime transit potential unlocked. And that what worries the United States. So the questions about Russia and China in the Arctic, Russia and China working together more in the Arctic is clear, objectively defined, and that's something what the Western and US policymakers have been focused for quite some time and should be focused more as a result of the war. But then Greenland is something that, in theory, or at least in Trump rhetoric, should address those issues. But I really don't see how this is related because no, there is not that much Russian and Chinese maritime activity around Greenland. No, getting Greenland under the US full control, establishing American sovereignty over Greenland, will not solve any of the challenges that Russia and China pose to the US interests in the Arctic because they are elsewhere in a different hemisphere mostly. And then the US is jeopardizing its most prized asset in the Arctic, which is a network of resourceful, helpful, like minded allies that are actually helping the US to address its security concerns. And I think that we heard a number of European Arctic leaders being on the record. I think Norwegian Prime Minister Geir Støre was the most eloquent, saying, hey, we have next door the Kola Peninsula in the Russian part of the Arctic with the largest concentration of nuclear submarines. and they're aimed not at Norway. They're aimed at you guys in the United States, and we are collecting intelligence and sharing this intelligence with you guys. And this is why we are your friends, and you should not undermine our common interest.
What
That's
would
my
you
reason.
call that? Allied burden sharing, stopping up the Russian submarine fleet in the high north, preventing them from running the GIUK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap. Back to your Cold War story, that's historically been the role and the specialization of the NATO alliance. And for those who've spent any time in the Nordic countries or are familiar in particular with their Arctic capabilities at a tactical level, and then I think also at a strategic level, because they are in fact in the Arctic. It's the low north in the Baltic and the high north in the Arctic, and they didn't need to be reminded by Donald Trump that the Russians are there, and that's the primary, great power story. But I want to dig more on this great power competition story, and you described these competitive relationships as well as an unusually cooperative relationship between China and Russia, a no limits partnership that's really blossomed in the period since Russia launched its war, mostly because China has them over a barrel, uh, or maybe that metaphor is wrong. They're drawing all the oil out of their barrel, like drinking milkshake out of their with their straw, like in There Will Be Blood. I don't know if you saw that one. Um,
No, I
at
haven't.
any rate, what's that? Oh man,
No, I haven't. Like, how
this
can I?
we may or may not keep this part, but it's a movie called There Will Be Blood.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
Daniel
Now I know
Day-Lewis,
what. Now
and
I know
it's
what
with
you're
respect
talking
to
about.
energy resources. He says,
That's
"I
right.
drink your
That's right.
milkshake, I drink it up," and I think the Chinese are saying more or less that in their actions. I think they actually keep themselves quite modest in what they say rhetorically, rather than upstage Russia. But if you actually watch the pattern of diplomacy, you see Putin in China talking very expansively about Arctic, polar Silk Road development, and singing the praises of the various Chinese firms who have rescued Russian gas projects, in particular, LNG2, and even more particular, in the Arctic that were abandoned by the West. And so I'm going to throw this back to you in a second, but I'm just thinking about great power competition. And you and I are old enough to remember when that came back in vogue in the first Trump administration. They were all about great power competition. And ultimately, the center of gravity, even in our world, in the now much maligned blob and its various, you know, diasporic communities in Berlin and elsewhere, uh, came around to the fact that it's obviously a much more competitive international environment than it was during some now obviously brief period of American unipolarity. And came around to great power competition just in time for the second Trump administration to pull the rug out from under everyone. GPC, the acronym, was de rigueur in every single briefing that anybody did in and around the entire defense enterprise in the United States, not just in the first Trump administration, but well into the Biden administration. I think they started calling it long term strategic competition with great powers, just a rhetorical change, nothing substantive. Everyone had accepted it. And now GPC consists, I think, of Greenland, Panama, Canada, none of which is a threat to the United States. It's a very puzzling moment, and I wonder what does that total radical upset or rupture, I think is the word in circulation now. What does that do to China's strategy, to Russia's strategy? Uh, how does that new version of great power competition translate into what they can do in the Arctic or more broadly?
I think that when people read the national security strategy and this hemispheric definition of U.S. privilege sphere of influence as allowing Russia and China to have their own sphere of influence, these are misleading for two reasons. Number one, Russia and China didn't ask U.S. permission to try to establish their own sphere of influence. Vladimir Putin has invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014 and then launched his war in Donbass and full scale invasion of Ukraine in 22 without waiting for Trump to issue his national security strategy. So he viewed certain parts of Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union space as
Right.
his
No
privilege.
collusion. They hardly collaborated on that at all.
Yeah, and I guess that the Chinese, when they use this nine dash line in the South China Sea, or say that Taiwan is an integral part of China and will need to be returned back sooner rather than later, or claim Senkakus, or uh, talk in vague terms, about their interests in other parts of Asia, they didn't ask Trump's permission. But second thing is that the reading in Moscow and Beijing is not that, oh, now this guy has licensed us to have our own spheres of influence because he now has this block, which is called Western Hemisphere. I think that the reading is the US wants the Western Hemisphere as exclusive zone where no other great power should have anything at all, right? No military presence, no viable commercial presence. So that's for America. And then everything else is where America is ready to compete and increase its influence, right? So our spheres of influence are not exclusively recognized, but they are up for grabs, and Americans want to compete that. And I don't think that this is an inaccurate reading. I think that it is
I,
precisely.
this is the most compelling analysis of this spheres of influence idea that's been going around that I've heard. And I'm not surprised to hear it from you, Sasha, sitting in Berlin and watching this unfold in all of its glory. But it's a really important point, and it goes to this question about, the return of great power competition or the return of spheres of influence, which are an associated concept. That's happening independent of Trump's mind. And it's happening independent of documents that they issue that may or may not reflect Trump's mind at any given moment. This process is underway. The way the Chinese, I think, would characterize it, and some Russians in a century ago, would be that there's some fundamental material changes to the world economy, to the balance of power would be a more palatable version of it that traveled to the West. But these are all basically material ideas that I think, at least in China, and I'm curious whether Russia can bring itself to think in material terms because they're so weak other than energy resources in that regard. But I think for China, the sphere of influence is a natural outgrowth of its power in Asia, just to be perfectly blunt about it. And they will be perfectly blunt about it in their deeds and every once in a while when they say the quiet part out loud, which their diplomats, I think, do less now than they used to, but every once in a while it slips. Thinking about spheres of influence too, and whether or not the U.S. needs to permit them. Permit me for a second to introduce a prop. This you may recognize as the Earth, and let's take a look at the Western Pacific. How visible is that for you?
That's
Are you
very.
looking up? I think we got it. Oh wait, you know what? Hold on. Does that help?
Yeah.
Let's
Does
see.
make
I
a big
think
difference.
this is an experiment. We'll get a good take at it.
Yeah.
What I'm looking at here is, this is the mainland of China, and we can't even see across the Pacific to the United States. But guess what? There's just a little bit of the United States, for some reason, colored the same way as China, yellow, which I'm sure is just incidental. And that's the geography that China sees. We could turn this way and look at it a little bit. They're just going to go around the east and get up into potentially the Western Hemisphere, but only after a very long ride through the Russian Arctic.
Yeah.
Take a look at that Russian Arctic, and all of the sea lanes are in Russian jurisdictional waters, even legitimate ones, right? Because it's their exclusive economic zone out to 200 nautical miles, and there's no navigable transpolar route at present. You started out talking about all of the new possibilities that melting sea ice creates, uh, resources being unlocked, but especially the flow of commercial shipping. And if you watch how China invests and how it has focused its resources and attention, I mentioned Putin coming to China. Should also mention all these Arctic mayors and governors. They're up there because they're selling oil and gas and they're soliciting Chinese investment now in a way that they couldn't before. And all the infrastructure required to make this very long shipping route uh, viable for China. Now, unless they want to take a hard turn and go through Canada on the Northwest Passage, we can look at this too. I think the polar view helps
Yeah.
really capture this. You could, in theory, come around to the East Coast and get to Greenland, but that means going through what was once, and I presume will continue to be, a very staunch NATO ally with very good domain awareness in the Arctic. China calls itself a near Arctic power, right? It's pretty far from the Arctic. This map helps you see that. The northernmost part of China is several thousand miles away from the Arctic Circle and much less access to the Arctic. You know who's also a near Arctic power if you exclude Alaska?
Yeah.
US.
Yeah.
US doesn't have any real estate in anywhere close to the Arctic but for Alaska. And I haven't heard Alaska brought up once by the president. You certainly hear it from Alaska senators and defense minded people who understand that's the only way. This is the only way that China gets to go to the Arctic. Just look at the map. And I fear that there are no globes in the White House for people to think through this in a sensible way. It's a round or spherical Earth, or just about, right? Sorry for the extended display here, but I feel like maybe this visual can illuminate uh, a strategic problem, a very obvious one to my mind. But what am I missing, Sasha?
No, no, you're not missing anything. I don't have a crystal ball that should be the same shape as your beautiful globus to read Donald Trump's mind. I would say it's probably not this object, but rather a color draw, like a computer program that help you color Greenland in the stars and stripes, right? You just do this one magic click, and then the map looks beautiful. And Trump posted that, right, including Canada, to
I
say like,
recall
"Oh look, that's a beautiful piece of real estate. That's really what I want."
the distortion on the Mercator map is so extraordinary. The size, not just of Greenland, which appears larger than Africa, a wonderful comparison. 14 times larger than Greenland is the great continent of Africa. Uh, Greenland's big, though. It's the biggest island in the world. And, someone told Trump that. And, Trump Tower is the biggest building in the world if you have a certain mindset. Uh, Take a look at Canada, too, in that picture. That Canadian sort of archipelago of islands in a sea of ice and permafrost looks also 14 times its size as well. And you have to figure, he's just looking at the Western Hemisphere and saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had this under control? But the funny thing is, it already was under our control. That's the quiet part out loud. As you well know,
Yeah,
Greenland, Greenland of all places, has been everything that the United States needed it to be as a platform. And the reality is, we didn't pay attention to it for a long time. The Danes certainly did. The Danes pay a lot of attention, and they've accommodated everything we've ever asked them until they started threatening to invade. And even then, they've been accommodating.
yeah. So again, it's very difficult to understand what's driving Trump apart from like, yeah, if you color that in U.S. flag and so on, if we get that expansion, that would be lovely. Straight line, though the obsession predates that, but straight line from very successful on tactical, technical level operation to extract Maduro from Venezuela. Like you show how really formidable still the U.S. Intelligence and military capabilities are, and like you pull off something like that so spectacular. Although from history, we know that missions like that are prone with mischiefs, mistakes, misfortune, and here not only has been the U.S. Men and women in uniform be very professional and brilliant, but also very fortunate too. Uh, and that goes immediately into decision maker's mind, and he believes that okay, everything is now possible, and then getting Greenland is probably possible. So that's me speculating, but I would
I,
not.
I want to stick with the bravura performance in Venezuela that you mentioned. And I think performance captures the essence of it. Um, a brilliant tactical success, although a fraction of an inch away from being a total debacle, not unlike Black Hawk Down in Somalia. Sometime before, could have lost, 20 Delta Force commandos, and maybe the whole mission would have failed. So it was very close. And I watched that, and I think about how does Beijing perceive this. That's sort of my number one analytic frame, and I think it is a great show of indiscipline from Beijing's perspective as far as how to manage a region if the United States truly aspires to being a regional sphere of influence hegemon, different from the way that we used to do it before, using more of a rule of law approach. As much as we transgressed it, that was sort of the idea of how you do this. China certainly doesn't feel a tactical threat from the United States to decapitate its leadership. Not only is that not an operation that could succeed, it's not one that would make any sense in a strategic context. They see the Washington mode now as being punch down and take easy wins. They'll recognize it from the Iran campaign during the 12-day war. Once all of the air defenses across Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and all the Russian support is gone, and the Israelis have already opened it up, they'll be very impressive tactically. They'll drop dozens of bombs down the same air shaft and high five one another on the aircraft carrier deck. That doesn't impress China. I just don't see it. From a strategic standpoint, it may impress people who are extremely online and like to watch military spectacles. But from a strategic standpoint, and I'll just make one last point and kick it back to you. China doesn't have any military strategic interests in the Western Hemisphere. Let's just say it straight up for now. And I understand that the appetite grows with the eating, and should China conquer Taiwan and Japanese islands, who knows what happens in the Western Hemisphere. But I feel very confident, and I feel like anybody who studies China will share my confidence that China does not intend to challenge the United States militarily in the Western Hemisphere. Not now, and maybe really not ever. And the idea that we're raising digging a moat around it makes no sense, because they'll just step right over it and continue to extract natural resources from the Western Hemisphere, which is basically their main strategic goal. In Latin America, in the Arctic, U.S. is a consumer market, a source of technology, irreplaceable for China. Of course, they don't want to see the United States sort of shrivel into a husk of its former self as a regional power. They want the U.S. to stabilize the global system, but I don't think they've been that confident in the U.S. in that regard since the great financial crisis. And at this stage, I'm just sort of curious, what do they see? What do you think Moscow sees? How would you correct my misinterpretation of what's going on in Beijing as they watch I would argue, self-harm in the Western Hemisphere starts to accelerate?
I agree with your analysis. I think, though, that to just mirror image that, uh, we ascribe to Vladimir Putin, given his past performance, the ability to take unnecessary risk, being drunk on his previous success. He thought that he will take Kiev in 3 days and just run over Ukraine in a couple of weeks and everybody will surrender. And that was setting in motion a historical blunder of his full scale invasion, right? And now the risk is that, oh, if he believes that NATO, in this 4 years of supporting Ukraine, has unleashed against Russia everything what it had in stash. And he has stomached all of this pain, and now he has the largest and most formidable fighting force in Europe that knows how to operate drones at scale and has those drones. And second to it is only the Ukrainian army that's, protecting the home turf. And now he can unleash that somewhere in the lower north, like the
Hmm.
Baltics. That's the kind of risk we should all be looking into, and not dismissing it. And I agree. I just participated in a German war game that was reported in today's Wall Street Journal, as we speak. I was playing Putin. Uh, was yeah
Which you usually only do in private. But
uh,
go on. How did it go?
yeah, yeah. That was a day in German, so I
Wow.
was allowed to wear.
German war games sounds ominous, but how about that? I'm very glad the Germans are thinking about this in
Yeah, and then
concrete
the bad
military
news about
terms.
this war game is that the German team, which was comprised of seasoned national security professionals, former head of the armed forces, who just recently retired, people from their intelligence community in very senior roles, sitting MPs, and so on, they lost. Like, they allowed the Russian team to take a chunk of the Baltics, stay there for 3 days, and the integral element of our success was Team US, which showed up to be non-committal to defending the Baltics, like a week away from the midterms, with Russians having created a lot of facts on the ground and promising de-escalation once there is a path to kind of rearrange the European security architecture and give Trump a big diplomatic win. So that's how we ended up. Again, every war game should be treated not as a prediction of what is likely to happen, but as a scenario exercise with a lot of limitations. So, coming back to your question, when the Russians are looking at Venezuela, they probably see the elements that you described, like, yeah, it gives us an easy way to say that the US is violating international law, and that it's hypercritical. It also is, the drive to get Greenland is straining its relationship with allies, which is the most important gain. Everything what was happening in Davos is definitely music to Putin's ears, and that's what you want to put in the pocket. And that's unrelated to the Arctic. The Arctic is not very important in that picture. What's important is support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's where the Russians want to keep the eyes on the ball right now. So this unity born out of this is helpful to an extent. But then, final point here is just, as the West perceives Putin as taken and able to take a necessary risk, being drunk on success, Russians can now not totally discount the opportunity that Trump will be taking risky decisions and will be much more cavalier about certain openings, than President Biden or President Obama, very cautious, steady, disciplined national security leaders. And I think that is something that should cross their mind. The problem is, if there would be a disciplined administration that would use this, as a tool of statecraft to instill that in the mind of your opponent, that, what, we actually might take additional risk in Crimea, in Ukraine. We actually might do something, because you don't want to mess with us. We are like this, cowboys, as you describe us, but like, we are really cool, really successful cowboys, right? And that's not what we are seeing from this administration. So I think that the Russians are concerned to some extent, but probably by now mostly focused on this disunity inside the NATO family, which is definitely music to Putin's ears.
Yeah, and the idea of the American cowboy marauding around reminds me of another, maybe not especially American metaphor, but the idea of this madman theory of the willingness to arbitrarily take on certain risks that can potentially deter an opponent. But that theory only works if there's not a madman behind it. You need to have goals that you're trying to destabilize your opponent from getting using the madman theory. That certainly was Nixon's mission, love it or leave it, and he was strategic. I just don't see it here. I'm not. I say the emperor's not wearing
He
clothes.
had Henry
There's a
the
lot of
Eighth.
other. There's a lot of other reasons for explaining this. None of them are geostrategy. I feel
Yeah, he had
equally
Henry Kissinger
confident in that.
at his back office.
Yeah.
Uh,
So let me. I know you have 3 minutes. Let's do it. Let's just do a lightning round. I want to say one thing, or maybe I'll just let me say it just quickly. The shadow fleet has been in the news, and it is very much a product of a long running sanctions campaign against what the U.S. has viewed as illegitimate oil producers. And it started in Venezuela, and it compounded and grew with Iran. And now with Russia, you have what many analysts are calling a shadow fleet or a black fleet, excuse me, dark fleet, that's carrying some extraordinary proportion of the world's oil and gas. And I say some extraordinary because it's impossible to measure within any degree of confidence because it's not observed. The whole point of it is that they're going dark and spoofing and hiding and repainting and whatever else. Um, this is accelerating, and the idea that it's just a shadow fleet, I think, uh, is a mistake when we consider that this is now the primary way that Russia and China, especially, and their clients who are resource rich for China, at least, Iran, Venezuela, and elsewhere, this is how they're going to convey their sanctioned goods around the globe. And there's not that much we can do about it. The U.S. is tasking squadrons of destroyers and all sorts of other very high end naval assets to chase clunky old oil vessels around who meanwhile are playing all sorts of tricks on them. It's cat and mouse. And you know what? There are not that many cats. The US Navy fleet ain't that big. And you know how many thousands of tankers and other boats can get out there and cause havoc. And so, we're dealing with what's not the rules based international order now. This shadow universe, not unlike Carl Jung's shadow self, is a reflection. It's a reflection of this light order, this conscious order that we're trying to maintain with the rule of law. You know what happens? Dialectically, perfect symmetry. We now have a system where we can't control oil and gas. Russia's a huge producer, China's a huge consumer, and they built their own infrastructure to make that happen, and it's growing at scale. Last round, I know you got to go. Lightning round. What is the next U.S. strike in the Western Hemisphere going to be, and why? Go.
oh my God. Uh,
Highest probability. There's so many options. Uh, your call.
mm, Cuba could be it.
Cuba.
Cuba could be it. Although that's really, really
If it's
tough.
up to Rubio, perhaps Cuba
Yes.
would be it. It's personal, not
Yes.
not business, and it could be better than Bay of Pigs. So we give them credit for that. That's probably
Yeah.
their benchmark.
And then strikes against cartels in
Cartels,
Mexico.
designated terrorist organizations,
Yeah,
maybe
probably.
dragged in under AUMF like
But
everybody
here
else.
I'm out of my depth. I think that to your shadow fleet, first, thanks for bringing Jung up. That elevates level of every discussion.
It's a think tank, Sasha. We need to think in
Okay,
elevated
okay.
ways.
Okay, then I'm allowed to use Tolstoy, but I don't have a
Yes.
good I don't have a good opening, so I won't use that. Um, I guess that when I hear you speaking about the limited capabilities that the U.S. Navy has to chasing this mice, uh, I have the same words of Mike Kaufman sounding in my head because that's exactly what our military analysis team at Carnegie are saying. Like Dara, Masiko, and Mike Kaufman are aligned with you on this. That yeah, this is splashy show off operations, but like, is that the best use of our resources? Do we have many of those resources, even combined with allies? That's tricky. I think that some of these moves, you see that these vessels are arrested and then released, some of them. And then, if people believe that NATO will at will just stop in international waters Russian vessels because they are Western sanctioned,
Mm.
that will be violation of UNCLOS. UNCLOS has been established precisely to not allow the coastal states to abuse the maritime freedom. And freedom of navigation is paramount for the United States. We know that the US has never ratified UNCLOS, and it's just, but it's adhering to it. So if you start to violate it under various pretexts, like, why would China, which has all of these capabilities to do that in the South China Sea, an increasing number of them, right? How can you justify that further erosion of the international law? That's point number one. Point number two, I think that if at some point, without clearly agreed operational plans, some Nordic countries decide that they are also capable to go after Russian shadow fleet. At some point, the Russians might actually test it,
Yeah.
and they might test it with naval assets because, like, you cannot absorb the pain all the time and just sit on your hands and do nothing.
Mm.
At some point, you need to respond, and I think that that's where Western decision makers need to be super, super careful. So instilling this calculations into the Russians and increasing costs for the shadow fleet is a noble goal. Don't get me wrong. But I think that every time there must be a designed person who looks at the risks of that and says, like, yeah, have we thought about contingency planning and how much risk we are ready to take on board?
Yeah. And we've been watching the various Nordic states take different types of law enforcement action and kind of exploring the space under the law of the sea. But now that you said law of the sea, you triggered me. Got my China's law of the sea book in the background. I won't do it. I promised myself that I wouldn't. But just one thing that I'll say about that is that the premise that the United States was a firm believer in the freedom of navigation was the only thing that really underpinned anybody's faith that the United States really cared about the rules based international order at sea. That's our number one interest. Nixon famously told Kissinger when they were negotiating this treaty over the course of the 1970s, he said, they're all poor down there, thinking about the third world countries that were really advocating for this. Let them fish. It's navigation we need. He literally, he said all sorts of fun things, but he said very specifically the way the United States has approached this for a very long time. And it makes sense as the strongest Navy in the world, especially with our network of allies and partners. It's advantageous to have freedom of navigation. And many may think that shooting up a bunch of fishermen like cowboys and Indians off in the Caribbean or in the Eastern Pacific um, is irrelevant to the broader order. Everybody knows that the United States has always been a bandit as far as China is concerned, but this actually really upends that fundamental premise. Freedom of navigation is hardly the gravest problem with these strikes. I'll leave that aside. But just the idea that the United States is saying we can arbitrarily designate someone in the high seas with whom we're not at war, we won't declare war, God forbid, um, and we will interrupt their freedom of navigation with lethal force. You can't even do a visit, board, search, and seizure on the high seas unless they're a stateless vessel, which I think is one of the things that they want to say. But except under self-defense circumstances, you can interfere with their navigation. You certainly can't use lethal force. And while maybe it seems a little legalistic and literal minded to say this is the United States completely abandoning even the thinnest shred of its long-term strategic commitment to freedom of navigation, it'll take a while for it to really fully erode. But I think that's what China sees, and you rightly point out, you know, they could be using all sorts of lethal force in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. Maybe not so much in the East China Sea. I think Japan genuinely poses a tactical, operational, strategic challenge there. But the Philippines, Vietnam, whom they have, as recently as 1988, had pitched battle with in the South China Sea, they could do it, but I suspect they won't. They'll continue to pursue their successful strategy, which is non lethal, highly intense coercion. And the U.S. is opening the door to that. So